And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, we are joined by Angelo Pizzo, who has written some of the most iconic sports movies of all time, including Hoosiers. Angelo is a native of Bloomington, a diehard IU fan, and we have a wide-ranging conversation with him, touching on a number of subjects, including his biggest regret with the movie Hoosiers, the time when he had to decide between going to the Academy Awards and watching in Indiana in the national championship game, a great story. Then we also talk about the current team, his thoughts on Archie Miller, how he compares to a young Bob Knight, and why he's so optimistic about the future of IU basketball. All of that coming on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Buying tickets can be complicated and confusing, but there is a better way to buy with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. Whether you're searching for a last-minute deal, planning a night out with friends, or need to find the perfect gift, SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone, have had it for a couple of years now, and it is by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets because I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I would love to use the SeatGeek app to pick up Mavericks playoff tickets this year and see Yogi, but obviously the Mavericks are not in the playoffs. But if you're in Indiana and you want to watch Victor, you want to watch Eric Gordon with Houston, or you want to watch OG with Toronto, or any other NBA playoff games, or any baseball games during the summer, SeatGeek is the way to go because SeatGeek is designed to make your ticket buying experience easier than ever. SeatGeek saves you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find amazing deals so that you don't have to go through all that legwork yourself. And best of all, listeners to Podcast on the Brink, like you, get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, today. That is promo code BRINK for $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. We're joined on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink by Angelo Pizzo, who wrote two of the most iconic sports movies of all time, Rudy and, of course, Hoosiers. Angelo is a native of Bloomington, received his bachelor's degree in political science from IU, and remains a steadfast supporter of the Hoosiers. And so we wanted to have him on to talk about all of those subjects and probably more. Angelo, welcome to Podcast on the Brink. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So there are obviously so many places that we can go with this conversation. So let's just start from the beginning. You grew up in Bloomington. How did you become an IU fan, and what are some of your earliest memories of cheering for the Hoosiers?
Well, some of my earliest memories about Indiana basketball are some of my earliest memories. And the reason is because my father got a job as a doctor in Bloomington when I was 3 years old and we were living in Chicago. Our first house was literally on campus now. It was off campus then. It was on 7th and Jordan, and that was 2 blocks from the old field house where Indiana played basketball. And I remember at a very early age, probably 5 or 6, of going over there and watching them practice. And I was such a regular there that I became a little mascot of the team. So when the campus was my playground. Whenever I ran into these basketball players around campus or at the Union Building, they would call me, little buddy, or, hey there, and they'd lift me up and put them on their shoulders or something like that. So it was my first live game was their IU games. They weren't high school games. So when people ask me about was it the love of Indiana high school basketball that was the impetus behind me writing Hoosiers? I said, well, the story comes from there, but my rootedness, my connectedness to all things Hoosiers are Indiana University basketball.
Who were some of those?
One of the things that I remember, well, I can tell you that one of the memories I had was Walt Bellamy. And Walt Bellamy was like the tallest human being I'd ever seen in my life. Remember, I'm like 2 feet tall or 3 feet tall or whatever. And he was, he was a really, really nice guy. And I remember rebounding when they had the free throw drills and passing it back to him. He was one of those people that actually picked me up and put him on his shoulder. And when I ran into the Union Building, and I felt like I was 2 stories high. It was just my first realization of what the world looked like from 6 feet. At that time he was 6'8", I think, but it felt like 7 feet in today's terms. The other person that I recall, because I kept in touch with him for reasons I'm about to tell you, is Gary Long, who was Big Ten Player of the Year and a great Indiana basketball player. And I ended up casting his son, Brad Long, to play Buddy in the movie Hoosiers. So he would show up on the set, and we get to reminisce. And one just on that tack, we also cast Jimmy Rail's son. Jimmy Rail was such a hero of mine too, the Splendid Splinter. Watching him 2 games, scoring 56 points. And most of his shots would have been 3-pointers, but they didn't have a 3-point line. I remember they talked about if there was a 3-point line when Pete Maravich was playing, that he would have averaged 56 instead of 44. I think those 56-point games for Jimmy Rail would have been closer to 70. But he was extraordinary to watch, and it was really a lot of fun getting to know him. Because we cast his son as one of the players on the opposing team. And Jimmy would show up and, even though he was like 40, 45, he could still shoot it. He would take on anybody in a shooting contest and beat them all. So those are some of my earlier memories.
How much was Jimmy Chitwood inspired by Jimmy Rail?
Not so much. It was here was my impetus, the idea behind Jimmy Chitwood. It came from the desire to make sure that the guys that we cast in those roles were great basketball players. And I'm telling you, it's really difficult to go for an actor first and hope they can play basketball. I think you can't train them to play basketball. They either have it or they don't at that age. So with Jimmy, I knew I was going to write a character with a line, with maybe 3 or 4 lines. So I was actually thinking more of Steve Alford in a way. What if there was a kid like Steve Alford who was just a deadly shooter? And, but I would have loved to find a Steve Alford, just because you could sell that filmically so well. But I knew it was going to be hard to find an actor who could do much. So we cast the best shooter that we could find in Indiana. And, he did enough to sell it. So we were fortunate in that regard.
Yeah.
Angelo,
the ironic. Yeah.
How did you get into film writing? Was it always a passion of yours?
That's sort of a long story. I'm trying to sum it up really quickly by telling you that my original idea, I fell in love with movies early. I never thought that there was a way to make a living at it. So I got a degree in political science. It was sort of a predicate before going to law school or going to State Department school in Washington. And then I just became disenchanted with that whole route. And my father encouraged me to do something I loved. And I always loved movies, but I never thought it as a vocation, just an avocation. But then I came across an area that I thought I could do well in. You know, when you grow up in a college town, everything is academic, and there was a growing number of film study programs at different universities. And there was one that was burgeoning here in Bloomington. And the director said if I got a PhD at one of three schools, the only three schools that gave out PhDs in film studies, then I would have a job back here in Bloomington. So the school I got into was USC, and my approach was academic strictly. I was going to get a degree in history, theory, and criticism. And I got a master's degree, and I was about to, I completed almost everything for my doctorate. And I ran out of hours to take there. So they gave me an internship for 3 hours at the last season of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Then I met the president. I became close to the president of the company, Grant Tinker, who introduced me to a producer who thought I would be a value to him working on a show about a large family in the Midwest. So I became his assistant. And from then on, I started to do a number of development jobs, which is basically being an executive, supervising production, and learning the ropes, learning the game, learning how things are done, learning what everybody does. And I never thought about writing at all. But when I got to a position after 5 or 6 years that I was in, I could develop my own projects. I got permission to develop a pet project that I always thought about, which was the relationship between the people in Indiana and high school basketball. I thought it was unique background, a unique canvas. And he said, okay. And I said, I want, and so I looked for a writer from Indiana. I wanted somebody who knew how people walked and talked and chewed gum. I didn't want somebody to come and do research. And I never found that writer. And I read a lot of scripts over the course of 3 or 4 years. And then the company I was working for at that time, Time Life Films, decided to split into 2 different entities, one HBO and the other TriStar. And they offered me a job. TriStar wasn't going to get going for another year, so that they couldn't offer me that. But they offered me a job at HBO, or they said they would pay my contract out in full, and that was 9 more months. So I took that 9 months of salary and decided I would try my hand at writing my own script. And that's how it started. And I've written 30 scripts since. So that changed my life. Yes, that movie and that first script changed everything.
So I want to ask you about Hoosiers. Obviously, I would be shocked if there's anybody listening to this that hasn't also seen Hoosiers and seen it multiple times and probably loves it. I know I can't even tell you how many times I've seen it. I used to watch it before all my high school basketball games to get amped up. And, you know, it's revered for so many reasons. But I'm curious, you know, when you watch it and when you think back on it, what are the scenes or the moments in the film that really stick out to you? And do you have any regrets about it? Or is there a scene that doesn't sit right for you? Or if you could go back and do it again, something that you would fix, no matter how small? Because, you know, any of us who create things, you know, we look at them differently than the other people who are consuming them. So I'm just curious how you view the film now.
Well, it's there was actually a lot of questions packed into that one question. But
yeah, there was.
I would say that, first of all, I don't watch the movie. I haven't seen the movie in a long time. But and if I'm like, you know, spinning through the channels and it pops on, I pop right past it. I've lived it.
That's impossible. I cannot do that. If it's on, I have to watch it.
Yeah, well, but being in the middle of the process of making the film, it's such a separate experience than what ultimately comes out. And you live through what the audience perceives. And we had just such great audience experiences that once it finally got out of the theaters, I think I went like 20 years without seeing it. And then they had a special opening for a new cinema here in Bloomington with great equipment. And so we watched it, I think, as I said, probably first time in 20 years. And that was about 7 years ago. And it was odd, you know, it's like watching maybe a game you were in high school. I feel very removed by it. But you mentioned something about looking in a different way. I keep on thinking about how creaky and how bad some of the dialogue is. If I were to go back and redo it, I would rewrite some of the dialogue. It feels like, I just started out, which I had. And if it wasn't for the great actors pulling that dialogue off, I think I would have been much more exposed. Now, in terms of regrets, I've made 4 movies, written many scripts. I try not to think about regrets or really ponder them too much, unless it's something that I learned from. And what I did learn from Hoosiers was that I wrote a script that I thought was going to fit the format of what a 2-hour movie was going to do. But the way in which we ended up, inventing things and extending scenes because they were working so well, and taking certain characters and adding scenes. Our first cut was 3 hours and 30 minutes long. We finally came down to a cut of 2 hours and 27 minutes that we felt was terrific. But our studio exhibitor would not let us release a 2 hour and 27 minute movie. We were not the Godfather. So my regret is a lot of those scenes, and maybe the best scene in the movie is out of the movie because of the necessity of keeping it under 2 hours. So I learned to be much more careful about what you shoot, because you can fall in love with stuff that just is never going to make the movie if you're not wise about selection.
What scene is that?
I will say that I'm going to say this: if anybody's interested in those last 30 minutes that are cut out of the movie, they can be watched. And there is a 20th anniversary of the movie that has a second CD that has those 30 minutes cut scenes they're not balanced for color, they're not scored from music, but David and I do an audio commentary on them and why they had to come out and why, how difficult it was how difficult it was for us to cut every one of those scenes.
All right. Well, I know what I'm asking for my birthday.
Yes. No, it's and also it's a full game of Mile and Muncie Central is on there, and a little documentary on the making of the movie. So it's well worth it if you're interested in Hoosiers. Just a little side note, it has nothing to do with basketball, but the relationship between Gene Hackman's character and Barbara Hershey's character was fully fleshed out and shot, but we had to cut 3 scenes between them. So what I did was and they're such great actors. I built the progression so when they finally kiss, that it made sense. Well, right now it doesn't make any sense. It's the one scene I have to look away. It just makes me, it just comes out of nowhere. But it would have made a lot more sense if you saw them growing closer in the 2 scenes we had to cut out, or 3 scenes we had to cut out. Anyway, that's a side note, but you're asking me regrets, and those are, that happens, movies are magic, and they work magically, or they just sit there like a souffle that doesn't rise.
Angelo, a couple weeks ago, Jerod and I had the privilege of interviewing Robert Abbott, who, as you know, you were a part of the process.
Uh-huh.
He made the ESPN 30 for 30 film, Last Days of Night, and you talked. We know that you're an avid IU basketball fan, and I think for a lot of people who watched that film, it brought back memories of some good things, some bad things, and I'm just curious, as someone who's followed the program as long as you have. If you watched that film, what kind of your reaction to it was, and how do you remember Bob Knight? Obviously did a lot of good things, and then the ending maybe not so good. But I'm just kind of curious, from your standpoint, your thoughts on the film. I know you were a part of it, and also how you remember Coach Knight and what he was able to accomplish in Bloomington.
Well, when I first got a phone call from Mr. Abbott, we had a long talk about my feelings about Coach Knight, and I got to know Coach Knight fairly well. and I'll tell you why in a second. But I said to him that the one thing about him that was always so striking to me was that everything about him was larger than life, his strengths and his weaknesses. And he was one of the most brilliant people that I'd ever met. And I can tell you, of all the time we spent together, and the first time we spent together was like 5 hours, just he and I, we never once talked basketball. And he didn't like to talk about basketball, but he was so brilliantly well-read in the area of history. And that's one of my favorite subjects. And we talked about the Russian Revolution for probably 4 or 5 hours. And I also told him that I think that what people don't realize and don't understand and misperceive him is their prism is so small. Their prism was so small because he's not around anymore in the public eye. And that was only on the sidelines of basketball games or in front of a camera with somebody asking them questions. Well, if you think about a person's life, they are, that's about, less than 1% of their waking time and, or their yearly time. Look at it that way. The times that I spent with Coach Knight, he wasn't yelling at waiters and, chewing people out or, the other thing people think about him, that he was just the grand pontificator, that he was the great expert on everything. Well, he had one characteristic that probably will surprise people, is he was a tremendously curious person. Our initial talk, through a series of talk, he wanted to know everything about Hoosiers, the movie, how it got made, and how, what it took, how I got into business. And usually with people who had achieved a stature like Coach Knight, they're kind of just expecting people to be, focused to them. And he may have vanity, he may have elements of narcissism, certainly, but at the same time, he really is curious and interested in other people. And so I just don't, I said that to Robert, the director, and he said, "You're just the kind of person I want to talk to, because I want to make this movie not from the point of view of someone who is a loyalist, who thinks that everything Bob Knight did was perfect. And I don't want to interview someone who wants to take him down, who has a lot of anger." So I think for the most part, he was able to do that. He tried to evenly balance the film. Where watching the film and seeing it in the final cut, it was painful because it brought back all those memories. And I can tell you, I felt and still feel that he was maybe one of the most brilliant coaches who ever lived. Just give you one little anecdote. I was making my movie about Texas football a couple of years ago, My All-American. I got to know the coach at Texas, Rick Barnes, pretty well. We were having lunch, and the subject of Bob Knight came up, and Rick said, "Well, here's how I feel about Bob Knight." He said, "I rank him as the greatest basketball coach who ever lived, college or pro, and that includes John Wooden." He said, and Red Auerbach. He said, I'll tell you why." He said, "If I had to go against one coach and we had equal talent, he's the only person I wouldn't have confidence that I could beat."
Wow.
I thought that kind of says it all. So, yeah, I mean, but there was a blind spot, in Coach Knight. And it's no secret that I did base the coach and Hoosiers on what I knew about him. Now, I didn't meet Coach Knight until after Hoosiers came out. And how that happened was that Joby Wright, who was an assistant coach and a friend of mine from college, I contacted him and I said, "Is it okay?" This is what was when Indiana had gotten to the Final Four and was going to New Orleans, which was a shock. But I asked him if it was okay if we send a congratulatory poster of Hoosiers, because remember, 1987 is when the movie came out, and that's the same year Indiana beat Syracuse. So we sent the poster, and it was hanging up in the locker room. I later found out that Coach Knight saw it. David and I signed it. This is the year of the Hoosiers, and he hung it there for both nights. And when he got back, he read the paper, and I'm going to tell you what the paper said, which was really interesting. You see, Hoosiers was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, Best Score and Best Supporting Actor. And David and I were thrilled. This was because of we were the writer and producer, director of the film. We got 4 tickets, and we were going to go and sit with our nominees. And this was exciting beyond belief. Well, it just so happened that the championship game and the Oscars took place on the same night. And I didn't think it was going to be a problem because Indiana in the Saturday game was playing UNLV. Well, UNLV was like, they were the number 1 team in the country. Indiana kind of, not that barely made it, but, they were not one of the favorites going in. So when they end up beating UNLV, it was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? How am I going to miss this game? And during rehearsal, I asked Dennis Hopper to bring a Sony Watchman into the arena, Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, to see whether we could watch the game while the Academy Awards were going on. And he said it didn't work, too much electronics. I woke up on Monday morning and I called David and I said, I can't do it. Indiana University basketball is more important to me than this movie stuff. I'm staying home and watching the game. And so David and I both we agreed, and we had a little party with the Academy Awards on one television, and then the great game with Keith Smart hitting the winning shot on the other set. And I got a call from a reporter from the local Herald Times and asked me what I was going to do. And I told him I was going to stay home and watch. We were going to stay home and watch the game. And so when Coach Knight got home, the front page of the paper, which I have framed, Hoosiers win national championship, and right down to the left is Hoosiers creators decide to stay home, watch the game rather than go to the Academy Awards. And he turned to Joby. He said, "These are the same guys that sent the poster." He said, "No, those are real Indiana fans. I want to meet them. They need to come here." So next time I came to town, which was about 3 or 4 months, it was actually about 6 months later because they were just starting practice. And I told them I was here and I came. And that's where I first met Coach Knight. But I'll tell you the circumstances. He kept on. I sat in the arena in the stands watching practice, and he was pretty mild mannered. Never thought he screamed all the time. He got upset a few times. It wasn't a big deal, but he kept on looking up at me, glaring at me, like making these faces, like he didn't want me to be there. And I thought he didn't know who I was, I didn't know what was going on. So after the practice, I just started to walk out of the arena, Assembly Hall, and one of the managers came up and said, "Coach Knight wants to talk to you." And I said, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong? What did I do wrong?" I kept on going through my head, anything I could have done to offend him. And I thought maybe he read about that I based this character on him. And, I was like really nervous. And I walked up to him and he stood there. He was talking to somebody else, and he's a very imposing guy. If you remember, he's a huge guy, but he carries a lot of crazy energy around him with him too. He finally turns to me, he looks at me, he said, he puts his hand out and he said, "You owe me some money." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You owe me money." I said, "What?" He said, "For all the lines, all the dialogue you used, that was all mine." And I said, "Are you serious?" And then he put his arms around me. He put his arm around my shoulder. He said, "Great job. Great movie." So that was the beginning of a very long friendship.
That is a great story. A great story. And by the way, the next time anybody questions my priorities for watching IU basketball games over other things, I'm gonna share with them what you just said.
True.
So we talk about Knight, and you and I have had some really good conversations about the current team and kind of the trajectory that Indiana is on. And so I'm curious. We've gotten now to see a full year of Archie Miller, and when Archie came to Indiana, he was renowned as one of the top young coaches in the game, and we've gotten to see him go through a season, go through some recruiting. In light of what you just talked about with Knight and kind of how you got to know him both as a person and as a coach, what similarities and differences do you see between a young Archie and a young Knight? And is it even fair to kind of try and make that comparison for a guy like Archie?
No, I think it is fair, and I'll give you two examples. I've been to two practices, Indiana practices, and I went to a whole bunch of Knight practices. One thing they share in common is focus on defense. Much more time is spent on defensive drills than offensive drills. It's not that they don't, both of them don't understand the importance of offense, but they know games are won on defense. And the other thing that really kind of stuck out to me is that as opposed to what Tom was trying to do and many other coaches, which is to try to throw multiple defenses at teams to throw them off rhythm or whatever reasons they are. They have one system. Knight had one system, and it's like it's kind of trying to create the repetition where you don't have to think. And I can't say that Knight coached the pack line, but I can tell you that the precision at which they work and the specifics to the detail of how they practice their defense is very much the same. And I'll mention number two, Chris Byers, who's the head coach of the state champion Warren Central team, has been went to a lot of Knight practices. I think he might have even been a manager, but and he said he's been to 20. And Archie has been very, very solicitous in a positive way to the high school coaches in Indianapolis, invited them down to practice anytime. And Chris has taken advantage of that. And he's been down there 10 or 15 times. And he said it's actually uncanny to him how similar the practices are between Archie and Coach Knight.
Wow.
So I'll take his word for it. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah. So, okay. So, you told us how you grew up in Bloomington. Then how long were you away once you were out in LA after that, right?
Yes.
And you were,
I went to grad school in 1976 or 1974 rather. And I stayed out there till, 30 years.
Okay.
But this is how much of a fan I was. Bob Hamill, who was the beat writer here in Bloomington, the sports editor, great writer, great friend. He wrote something about Indiana basketball, Indiana sports every day. And the local Herald Times, this is obviously way before, technology has changed things here. I used to take a subscription to the Herald Times, and it used to come in batches a week late. So I would read all of Bob Hamill's articles about Indiana basketball a week after it actually happened. And what was frustrating, of course, is there were very few games on television. And they maybe had game of the week. So if I never came back during the fall season, I would only get to see 2 or 3 Indiana games. And I must say there were a number of reasons why I moved back to Bloomington, most particularly to raise my kids in a great environment. But knowing that I would once again have season tickets to Indiana basketball and football was a real inducement as well.
Well, if I ever move back, those will be the two main reasons too. So I can relate with that. So since you've been back, obviously since Coach Knight was fired, we all know how topsy-turvy and up and down things have been with the IU program. And since you've been back, there have been a few instances where it felt like things were on the right track. When Kelvin Sampson got Eric Gordon to flip and the way that season started, it felt like things might be going in the right direction. The bottom obviously fell out. With Tom Crean, you have the big upset over Kentucky, and then the 2013 team that's preseason number 1 and number 1 seed, and obviously that wasn't able to sustain. And now it feels like we're on the cusp or maybe in the midst of another big shift as well with, the recruiting class and Romeo Langford committing and the confidence everybody has in Archie's coaching. Do you feel that same sense of optimism, being up close, being in Bloomington now? And does anything about it feel different than some of the other moments since Coach Knight left where it kind of felt like Indiana was back to maybe being able to sustain the kind of success that we all got used to?
Well, it does feel different for me, and I can see the comparisons, and I will admit to always being a glass half full person when it comes to these kind of things. But when it comes to Indiana football or basketball, but I'll tell you why it feels different. It feels different because I knew enough about Kelvin Sampson that I was a little nervous about how he got things done in Oklahoma. I'd heard enough. I got to know, because of Hoosiers and Rudy, I got to know a lot of college coaches, and I got to find out which coaches did it the right way, which coaches kind of played on the edge, and it never felt right to me. Kelvin never felt right to me. It also, I knew that Mike Davis, when they got that team to the final in 2002, was it? I knew that wasn't going to sustain, because when I went to visit and I got to know Mike, before he became head coach, he was the nicest guy in the world, but he basically farmed out the coaching to two other assistants. And I would come to practice and he would end up talking to me for half an hour instead of actually coaching. And then with Coach Crean, I was a little bit, I didn't buy the bright, shiny object. I wasn't totally convinced that this 2013 season was going to sustain, in part because the movement started to fragment a little bit. But I also had observed what had happened to him at Marquette. That when he left, he did not leave with people missing him. And everybody seemed, in all the research I knew somebody very, very well whose brother was an assistant athletic director there, saying that they were happy to see him go, and that, he doesn't wear well over a long period of time. And that actually turned out to be true, around the same amount of time. So now with Archie, I don't have any of those doubts, because I see what he did at Dayton, but also observing him in press conferences, listening to him. He's such a no-nonsense guy. I mean, and he knows who he is. He knows what he wants. He knows the kind of kids he wants to go after. And I don't mean to be bashing Tom, but, Tom would offer recruits based on they shot well in one game he saw. I mean, Tim Priller, Grant Galen, those are two kids that will never, and as great, nice kids they are, I mean, Archie in a million years would never have offered them at Dayton. So I think that that Tom could be very reactive in the moment. Archie's a very long thinker. And I also believe in the people he has surrounded himself with. I mean, Ed Schilling's a very special guy. I've known Ed for a while. And you know how critical he was in bringing some of these kids in, especially Romeo. He's trained. He's got a great resume, but he's a good soul. He's a good person. And, Bruiser is a terrific person, and so is Tom Ostrom. I mean, Tom Ostrom is really the unsung hero here, too. He's a great recruiter, in part because, you just like to talk to him. He's just a really good guy. And, I think that those guys all know their roles. I think at times it wasn't clear from Coach Crean and some of the other assistants exactly who should be doing what at different times, because Coach Crean would change his mind. Well, as I said, I mean, this feels like a much more organized group built for the long term. I think that they have a long-term vision, and these 4-star kids that are coming in here are going to be around next year and the year after, unless one of them, breaks out, especially. And I think Indiana's going to be really, really good. They're going to be exciting and interesting and fascinating to watch next year with Romeo. But I think year 2 and 3, after Romeo leaves, that's when they could be great.
Yeah. Well, Angelo,
I think they're going to get a couple of new recruits in 2019 that are going to be special. I also think the game of basketball is going to be a little different because there will not be. I think it's very clear the one and done rule is going to be gone after this year.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's trending that way. Well, Angelo, you've been so generous with your time. I want to ask you one last question. It's a question that I've always wanted to ask you. If a studio came to you, or someone came to you with just an unlimited budget, and they said, "We want you to write a movie about Indiana basketball. You can pick any subject you want, anything you want, but we want you to adapt a story from the history of Indiana basketball for a major movie." I'm curious what the subject would be that you would choose.
Wow, that is a tough question. Now, I'll tell you where my head went immediately, although I have to think about it, I'd have to think about it maybe a little more to give you a final answer. But my first reactive answer is I was asked to write a 10 to 15 minute play for the Indianapolis Repertory Theater. Did a bicentennial celebration of Indiana, and they wanted me to write something having to do with basketball in Indiana. And I came across a story which was really fascinating, and that was how Indiana basketball became desegregated, and how Herman Wells and France and I can't think of his first name, Andre de France, got Bill Garrett to finally be accepted. It was not the most racially sensitive town, Bloomington, in 1947, and Bill Garrett was a hero. He was a really, really special human being, and I got to learn a lot about him. And there was a really wonderful book written about him too, and this whole era. So I think that would be a fascinating story about how Indiana basketball opened up to recruiting blacks earlier than others, and it really helped them along the way.
Well,
I think that would be an interesting area.
That's a great answer, because it was actually the answer that I was hoping that you would give, kind of secretly, when I came up with the question. That book that you're mentioning is called Getting Open. I'm looking at my copy of it right now. Just a fascinating book. To me, it is the greatest story that's ever been told about IU basketball. Because few things were more meaningful than what Bill Garrett did and what he meant. So that would be a great story to tell. And I feel like it's one of those stories that not enough Indiana fans know about and have the proper amount of pride in. And so I try to spread the word about that book as much as I can.
You can, and I've actually talked to the author about adapting it as a film. So we've had these discussions for a couple of years, and it might come to fruition. It's not we're down the road with it a little bit, so it's not just
wow. That would be
not just something that popped up today.
That would be incredible. The other option, of course, would be to do a hypothetical retelling of the 1993 season if Alan Henderson doesn't blow out his knee. But that's it's neither here nor there.
I don't recreate nightmares.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't. How about Ted Valentine in Minneapolis? I was there. He robbed Indiana of winning a fourth national championship.
He sure did.
That was, to me, the biggest travesty. When you get injuries like Scott May in 1975, Alan Henderson, those are just acts of God.
Yeah.
But was Ted Valentine an act of God? Yeah, he was an act of the devil is what he was. He single-handedly robbed Indiana of a championship. It was a travesty, the biggest travesty I've ever seen on a basketball court.
It was an act of the devil. That is the best way to describe it. Best way to describe it. Well, Angelo, thank you so much for taking the time. This conversation has been fantastic, and hopefully we can have you on again sometime in the future as Archie Miller continues to build this up, and we experience what we all hope and expect is going to be some pretty good basketball.
My pleasure. It was great talking to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Angelo.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.